Good morning. Saturday or Sunday, we'll say Shavua Tov, which means a good week for everyone. Heard a lot of talk of love already this morning. Valentine's Day coming, and I have my wife Jennifer Robbins with me, so how appropriate is that? But I can't help think about the late Burt Baccarat and Hal David, because what was one of their great songs, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's much too little of." Sorry, Philip. I couldn't resist. Thank you to Plymouth Congregational. What wonderful hosts you have been. Dr. Davis, Reverend Patterson, all of the clergy whom I'll soon thank. The embrace of transfer of memory, the welcoming of myself, my colleague Susie Greenberg, Laura Zell, who's not here, my assistant Cheryl Snitkin, the collaboration, the partnership has been a tremendous. I always say the transfer of memory exhibit assumes the characteristics of its surroundings, and certainly that has happened today. Manny Gabler speaking in the forum, he's the first picture that you see. This has been a remarkable learning opportunity. Thank you again for this collaboration. I hope it continues. But let me just say, I want to make sure people are thanked because so much effort has gone in to these days. As I said, Dr. Davis, Reverend Patterson, Reverend Faith, Philip Brunel, Maria Jetty, the entire choir, the bell choir, Malcolm Williams, Hope Esperolini, who literally kept hope alive because the exhibit was first scheduled to come to the church March 2020. Well, we all know the significance of March 2020, but here it is. It's happened, thankfully, and we are deeply grateful. Cody and Slats, the wonderful technical crew, couldn't have done it without all of everyone that has made this possible. Going off script, briefly, I'm going to have a sort of moment of personal privilege here. We're having a little bit of a gathering of the Alumni Association, the Minnesota Attorney General's Office. I worked at the Attorney General's Office from 1990 to 1996, and we have with me my colleagues of that time, Justice Chudich, Judge Smith, Tom Fable, Marty Munich from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and we go back to the days of Hubert Humphrey as Attorney General, in Tom's case to Warren Spanis, the late Warren Spanis as Attorney General, so this is really something of a gathering of friends on top of everything else. Thinking about the year 1857, in which this remarkable congregation was founded, organized, was also the year of the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, as you recall, was an African-American, wouldn't have called it in that day, was brought here by a physician to Fort Snelling, and whose case essentially precipitated the Civil War. I should say the holding in the case precipitated the Civil War. Remember, my talk for today is the giving of the law, the taking of the law, but I'm actually going to reverse that when we think about the Dred Scott case, because that was actually the taking of the law in the giving of the law. The holding in the Dred Scott case actually reversed the law and made it impossible for a black person to be a citizen of the United States, which is in contravention to the law as it stood at that time. It took the fighting of the Civil War, the enactment of the 14th Amendment, and the very first clause in the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Clause, to rescind, essentially, the holding in the Dred Scott case. But I call it to our attention because 1857, a wonderful year of founding of this church, was also sort of a dramatic moment in American history which led to all that would follow. I also mention it because one of my great heroes in life is Judge Michael Davis, the former chief judge of the Federal District of Minnesota, a longtime friend of the family. And when Judge Davis became the chief judge, he took it upon himself to bring to bring the court to the people. He did that by way of historical exhibits, among other things. The first very one was about the Dred Scott case. The second was he brought the Lawyers Without Rights exhibit to Minnesota, which was sort of a study of what was the fate of German Jewish lawyers and judges after Hitler came to power and the meaning of the disintegration of the rule of law. About that, we'll talk a little bit later. But now let's talk about the giving of the law. Just a word of background here. Jews throughout the world, on any given Sabbath, Shabbat, read the same Torah portion, that is, the weekly reading from the Torah, 5 books of Moses. The Jewish canon involves the Torah, Ne'evim, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the sacred writings. I have in my hands right now the Eitz Chaim, which is the conservative movement's commentary on the Torah. Eitz Chaim meaning tree of life in Hebrew. The metaphor from the Proverbs is the Torah is a tree of life to those who will cling to it. But it just so happens, and why, as we say, B'Sheret, how things are fated, that this week the Torah reading is Parshat Yitro, Jethro, father-in-law, the Midianite father-in-law of Moses. Gets its name because that's exactly the first word of the Parsha, Yitro. And Yitro is all about justice, judiciary, and then finishing with the Ten Commandments. You can't imagine, from a lawyer's perspective, anything more rich than Parshat Yitro, right? Well, Jethro, Yitro, looks at Moses and says, Moses, you got a problem on your hands. You can't possibly adjudicate all these issues that are arising amongst the people, particularly in the wake of the Exodus. So it takes, again, the Midianite father-in-law of Moses to suggest you need judges. You need people who are going to be sort of your vicars of justice. And of course, it says in the Torah, you shall seek out from among all the people capable men who fear God, trustworthy men who spurn ill-gotten gain. Well, that's all about due process law, because you can't transmit the law. You can't adjudicate disputes amongst people unless you have trustworthy, honest men and women. Of course, it says on the Supreme Court, equal justice under law, right there at the front entrance of the Supreme Court. In a way, it dates back to what Yitro was teaching Moses, but of course it goes back even further in time: Moses, Hammurabi, Solomon, Confucius, Solon. And why do I say those names? Because those are the folks that are in the friezes at the Supreme Court. So that's one function. Yitro says you have to have judges, Moses, if you're going to maintain this as a polity, right? But now I'm going to read to you, because of course the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, is also part of this Torah portion. So you have it in your program guide for today, and it's beautiful, but I'll just read part of it. God spoke all these words, saying, I, the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, you shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not swear falsely by the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet. And then it concludes with, you gave us a Torah of life, the love of kindness, justice, and blessing, mercy, life, and peace. May you see fit to bless your people, Israel, at all times, at every hour, with your peace. Blessed is Adonai, source of peace. The distillation, what is the distillation? 613 commandments. You have the Torah, you have the Talmud, you have the oral law. You have thousands of years of Jewish law. But maybe its essence is the following. 36 times, and it's the most oft-repeated commandment of the Bible, the following is said: you shall respect your neighbor. You shall treat the neighbor as yourself, because you were a slave, you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. And I think that's part of our patrimony as Jews and Christians, is that we assume that as a basic part of our life and of our love, the need to treat each other with decency and respect at all times. Little chat piece about anti-Semitism. The original replacement theory was supersessionism, the idea that the Jewish covenantal relationship with God was abrogated by the Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus. To some in Christian thought, at various times, that meant that the Jews were a forlorn and hopeless people cast upon the rock or rubbish heap of history. Dangerous things can happen when that is the consideration you make of another people. The better news is, almost all official church doctrine, whether it was the Nostra Aetate by the Catholic Church in 1965 or the Protestant denominations, have rejected this idea. Indeed, the 16th General Synod of the UCC in 1987 said, affirms its recognition that God's covenant with the Jewish people has not been rescinded or abrogated, but remains in full force. And I take this to mean, within our deeply held respective faith traditions, that we draw strength, all of us, from the Eitz Chaim, from the tree of life. Now I talk a little bit about the taking of the law, and again, going back to this important exhibit that Judge Davis brought to the Twin Cities, indeed throughout Minnesota, this Lawyers Without Rights. About the very first thing that the now Nazi captive Reichstag promulgated, April 7, 1933, was a restriction, practically a disbarring of all Jewish, almost all Jewish German lawyers and judges. Why start there? Of all things, well, first of all, it was part of the roadmap to the disenfranchisement and marginalization of German Jews, but also striking a blow at liberty, at justice, at the due process of law. That was a topic that when Lawyers Without Rights toured Minnesota and throughout the state that we discussed at some great length. There are a couple of particularly poignant events associated with that exhibit. One was a commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Kristallnacht, which we conducted at the state capitol. Some may have been there will remember Ed Shames, who was one of the band of brothers from Virginia who came out and told his story of a liberator of a concentration camp. Secondly, Larry Tillemans. Larry was from Minneota, Minnesota, near Edgerton, southwestern part of the state, and he devoted himself. He was part of the prosecution team at Nuremberg as a clerk typist, compiling affidavits, doing a lot of the important ministerial work necessary to put together the very first war crimes trial at Nuremberg in 1945. But years later, he discovered that people were denying the Holocaust, and he took it upon himself, quite independent of the JCRC, to travel throughout the state, sort of in a Graham and Moses type way, telling the story of what he saw, because he did not want people to deny the Holocaust. And we had Jerry. He's like one of these blessed souls that you'll see come and present to our group at the University of Minnesota Law School. Indeed, I'll commend to you the documentary about Larry called The Typist. Look it up, Google it. It's really something to watch. But at the end, we thought about what does it mean when the rule of law disintegrates in society. Truthfully, Weimar Germany was not a very strong and vibrant democracy. It grew out of the First World War, did not have a democratic tradition necessarily like the United States. Nevertheless, there are lessons to be learned, and Chief Judge Davis wrote the following, quote, "The lesson to learn from this assault on the rule of law is its fragility, even in a civilized nation, and the ease with which a popular ruler can employ fear to achieve an oppressive totalitarian state." Ultimately, in World War II, the rule of law prevailed, but at great cost, and certainly exposed, as it has been since, many of the fault lines and racism and anti-Semitism and issues in our own country. I'll conclude with the following thought. Ida Wells, people may know, was a great African-American woman, journalist, suffragette, and she campaigned for an anti-lynching law 100 years ago. Now, it took, by the way, to our eternal shame, until last March or last April for President Biden to sign into law the Emmett Till federal anti-lynching law. Nevertheless, it finally got done. But her quote was, "Turn the light of truth upon the wrongs." Turn the light of truth upon the wrongs. Bringing together the giving of the law and the taking of the law, and let's hope the giving of the law, is the fact, talked about the Torah, in a synagogue above the Arona Kodesh, the Holy Ark, is the Ner Tamid, the eternal light. So if you synthesize what Ida Wells had to say with the Jewish tradition of the eternal light above the Torah, we say, may the light of law and justice forever shine upon us. And with that, thank you. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak here for this wonderful and holy congregation, and may we all go from strength to strength.